This week on Dialogue, the latest on Mexico's drug wars and a look back at terrorism and counterterrorism in Palestine and Israel. Welcome to the Woodrow Wilson Center in Washington, D.C. I'm John Molesky. Each week, Dialogue explores the world of ideas and issues in international affairs, history, and culture. Our first guest this week is Eric Olson, Associate Director of the Wilson Center's Mexico Institute. Eric joins us to discuss the ongoing drug violence taking place in Mexico against the backdrop of a presidential election. Eric, welcome back to Dialogue.
Good to see you, John.
Is it accurate to say that the violence is escalating, or is that more a perception based on reporting of some of the more graphic atrocities?
Yeah, there's been some really gruesome and graphic atrocities recently. It's good to look at it in perspective. The context is that in 2010, the violence increased by 70%. And by violence, I'm talking here specifically about homicides. Mm-hmm. In 2011, it increased around 11%. And actually, the trend lines this year are heading a little bit down from 2011. Still extremely high, still a real problem, but seen in that perspective, things are improving slightly at a national level.
Americans who are viewing this through headlines or through video or through news reports, do you think they have a really distorted impression of how stable or violent the nation is?
Yeah, I think there are two or three things that tend to happen. Obviously, the gruesomeness of it captures our attention, and there was a case of 49 dismembered bodies recently, and so there's a tendency to focus on that, and I'm not minimizing it in any way. It's really a horrible thing, but that's more the exception than the rule. So we tend to focus on that, and we also tend to forget that the violence is relatively focalized in 5 or 6 states in key areas. It spreads from time to time, moves from area to area, but it's not a national phenomenon of that level of gruesome violence. Mexico City, for instance, is actually a relatively peaceful place. It's a city of 9 to 11 million, and its homicide rates aren't all that high certainly compared to the rest of Latin America, much below the average there. So it's hard to keep that context in mind in the United States.
If you make that comparison, you mentioned other big cities around Latin America. If you made the comparison of Mexico City to New York City or Philadelphia or a large American city, how does that rate?
Well, it's comparable in many ways. The numbers for Mexico City, and the way we usually measure this level of violence is number of homicides per 100,000. Mexico City is in the vicinity of 10 to 11 per 100,000. New Orleans has been as high as 60 and 70 per 100,000 different times. Detroit much higher. New York has come down, other major cities, and the United States has seen homicide rates go to historically low levels overall. So maybe it's not a great comparison, but Mexico City is a relatively peaceful place. Other people point to Colombia as an example of great reductions in violence and an improving situation. That's partly true, but their homicide rate is around 30, 32 per 100,000, and Mexico's as a nation is right around 20, 22 per 100,000, 30% less than Colombia.
Who are the combatants? Is this cartel versus cartel, or is this law enforcement or military versus cartel? Who are the combatants?
All those things. I mean, it's a very jumbled mess of organized crime groups. Some of those organized crime groups are involved in bringing narcotics, illegal drugs, primarily cocaine from the Andes region into the United States. They are violent, but they're not the most violent, because at the end of the day, they're most interested in moving their product into a U.S. market. And the violence that is generated in Mexico or in Central America takes away from them. They use violence, but they're not the most violent. The more violent groups are what we would call local criminal organization, local criminal gangs that are involved in extortion, auto theft, distribution of retail drug markets, kidnapping, those sort of localized criminal activities that the transnational trafficking organizations, mostly allow to go on and maybe charge them a tax, quote unquote, but are less involved. Those local criminal activities are much more violent. And then thirdly, as you mentioned, obviously there's conflict between state authorities, whether it's the Mexican military or federal police or local police, that generates violence as well. What we've seen overall is as kingpins have been taken down, the groups fracture, become much more competitive amongst themselves, and that has generated big spikes in violence.
It's like this classic turf war among warring criminals.
Yeah, it's for control of routes, it's for control of territory or entry points into the United States, and it's competition amongst themselves. Innocent people are being killed. Don't get me wrong, it's not all bad people being killed. But a lot of the violence is generated by this local competition for control of territory, routes, and access points.
Do we have good statistics on how much spillover to innocents occurs in those being killed?
In Mexico, yes and no. The problem is that, and this is where you get into some of the underlying issues, Mexico's justice system has really been lacking. And so their ability to investigate these cases and determine clearly in a court of law who's guilty, who's not, who's the victim, who's not, has been weak. And so at best we have approximations. The approximations are maybe 20 to 30% are quote-unquote innocent victims, but we don't know for sure.
President Calderon has attempted to engage the military in a way that hadn't been done before versus making this simply a law enforcement issue. How has it worked out?
Well, that's a very good question. Actually, involving the Mexican military in public security has been slowly happening since the 1990s. What Calderon did was significantly increase it and put them more directly in the streets, patrolling the streets. The problem for the Mexican military is they don't have the legal authorities to do law enforcement work. They can be a presence, they can be a dissuasive presence, but they can't investigate crime, they can't interview people, they can't engage at that level. So their role is limited. Now, where you have local and state police in Mexico that are either fully penetrated or corrupted by the organized crime, or they're just weak and ineffective, the military becomes the de facto law enforcement. And to that extent, that's a helpful role for them to play. I don't think that they're going to, quote-unquote, solve the problem. It takes much more than just simply mobilizing forces to deal with this problem.
And President Calderon has suggested that some of this extreme violence we've seen is a sign that the cartels are on their heels. Is that a credible claim, or is that political spin?
I think in some cases it's true that in some of the groups, as they are increasingly weakened and splintered, to project more force, they engage in greater and more gruesome violence. I don't think that's always the case. There are cases in which very powerful cartels, like the Sinaloa cartel, tried to send a signal, a message to a rival by going into their territory and capturing 10, 15 of their people, dismembering them, whatever horrible thing they do, as a signal to them. But there are some cases where it's a sign of weakness and they're trying to project. What we're learning is that this is not just cartels in a sense of one or two big groups. There's a number of groups engaged in criminal activity. They're splintered, they're fractious, and it's really tough to overgeneralize amongst them.
Now, we're recording this interview in late June, but when it first is broadcast, it will be July 1st, the day of the elections. Yeah. The presidential candidates have been talking about a change in course as it relates to drug violence, maybe shifting gears from this Calderon approach that you say, of course, predates him about engaging the military. What are they talking about? What is the alternative approach?
Well, it's a subtle but important approach. We know that by the end of the Calderon administration, somewhere in the neighborhood of 75,000 Mexicans will have lost their lives. Originally, the priority was put on dismantling organized crime, and the violence was kind of a tragic, necessary side element of the whole thing. The violence itself was seen more as a symptom or a byproduct, if you will. I think what's changed in Mexico is that the Mexican people have demanded of their government a focus specifically on the violence. What upsets normal, everyday Mexicans trying to go to work, go to school, go to church, visit their family, is the violence. They're less preoccupied about cocaine coming from Colombia to the United States. They want the government to have a strategy that's specifically designed to bring down violence and bring justice. And so the candidates are beginning to reflect the need to have a violence reduction strategy as an element of their overall security strategy.
Some vested, or not vested interests, but parochial interests in the United States are concerned that this doesn't necessarily serve U.S. interests in that it's less focus on the flow of drugs to the United States. Is that a legitimate concern?
I don't think so, because I think what the candidates are all saying is that they will continue to confront organized crime, but they will make violence reduction a part or an element of their strategy. And this is why it's important. Extreme violence means citizens no longer have faith in their government. They're afraid. And all the victimization polling says that roughly 1 in 5 crimes is even reported in Mexico. At some level, to turn the corner on this, you need to win back the public support and get them more involved in law enforcement and crime fighting. And so you need to start by reducing the violence that they're feeling. It's an important element. I don't think it means that any of them are going to turn a blind eye to the drugs coming in. I think the U.S. should embrace this as an important element for making the strategies more effective and encouraging citizen involvement in crime fighting.
Long-term solutions versus short-term solutions, it sounds like.
Absolutely.
We only have about a minute and a half left, Eric. I'm not going to put you in the position of being a political pundit, but since it is the election day while this is being broadcast, give us just a sense of what are the issues that will decide this election. I'm not going to ask you to make a prediction unless you want to. Where does it seem to be headed?
You know, in the final analysis, the focus of the last weeks of the campaign has been change. It's not been security. It's not been the economy. It's, do you have faith in the old ruling party, the PRI? Do you believe that they have reformed and can come back and lead Mexico in a good and positive direction? Or do you have faith in the PAN party that's ruled for the last 12 years? They've done a good job. Do you have faith that going forward they'll continue to do it? Or do you have faith in the left to be new and innovative? So they've framed it as a question of change. Who will lead the country going forward? Who represents a past that everybody would like to leave behind? And we'll see what happens.
We will be watching. Thank you very much, Eric.
Thanks a lot, Sean.
We'll return in a moment with part 2 of this week's program. Welcome back. We're now joined by one of the nation's leading experts on terrorism and counterinsurgency, Bruce Hoffman. Bruce serves as director of the Center for Security Studies at Georgetown University's Walsh School of Foreign Service, and for at least the next few months is a distinguished scholar with the International Security Studies program here at the Wilson Center. Bruce, we're happy to have you in our halls. Thanks for joining us.
Delighted to be here.
And thanks for joining us on Dialogue as well. I want to ask you about your upcoming book and your project, Anonymous Soldiers. Tell us about what story you'll be telling.
Well, the title Anonymous Soldiers was a poem that was written by Abraham Stern, who was a radical activist in pre-state Israel. He had joined an underground organization called the National Military Organization, subsequently split from that movement when it declared a truce when Britain entered World War II and stopped fighting against British rule of Palestine, and then formed his own separate organization, a terrorist group known as the Stern Gang. So Anonymous Soldiers was the title of a poem he had written. He was quite erudite, had attended Hebrew University, had won a very prestigious scholarship to study in Italy. And then that became sort of the theme song for these underground movements, terrorist organizations. And it really encapsulates, I think, a largely unknown dimension of the history of Palestine and Israel, where on both sides, Arab and Jewish terrorists were convinced indeed that their violence would have a decisive influence on British policy for the country, and where both sides also believed that their violence could tip the balance in their favor.
Poetry, not normally a vocation or avocation we associate with terrorism. And so it makes me think about the definition. When you say he's a terrorist, when you talk about someone in that time frame compared to what we define as terrorism now, are we talking about the same thing or has it changed?
Well, we're talking about the same thing, but at the same time we have to make some important qualitative distinctions or judgments. Terrorism back then, I mean, this is what it was called by the British, this is what it was called by the Jewish community in Palestine, this is what it was called by the international press. I think, fascinatingly, the press back then had showed fewer constraint in actually labeling this violence terrorism than we see today. I think the most important distinction is that the groups back then didn't enshrine the targeting of civilians, generally speaking, as sort of the preeminent goal of their organizations. I think terrorism has changed in the 21st century, where civilians have become the main targets. Plenty of civilians were killed during that period, but they were very different groups. But nonetheless, the violence they used was for having a profound psychological impact, for the purposes of intimidation, for the purposes of influencing decision-making in a way that they believed nothing else could. And those, form at least the core of what a definition of terrorism has to have as its elements.
What about the counter terms, counterterrorism, counterinsurgency? Did they exist in this time frame, and did they mean the same things they mean today?
Counterterrorism did. I think counterinsurgency is really a much more recent phenomenon, that term. In point of fact, the British rarely called them terrorists. Occasionally they did. Most of the time they called them thugs, murderers. In other words, they attempted to delegitimize any political dimension of their causes on both sides. Bandits was another term that was widely used.
And that's the important distinction between a criminal and a terrorist, is that there is this political dimension.
Precisely. That's absolutely essential to the definition.
So describe the battlefield for us. Who were the players? Who were the various groups that were competing politically and sometimes expressing themselves through terrorist acts?
Well, you have to begin really with the Balfour Declaration in November 1917, which committed Britain to establish a Jewish national home in Palestine. And what one saw is that literally from the time that British rule began of a territory that hadn't been a cohesive unitary entity, that had actually been two provinces of the former Ottoman Empire, literally from the time that British rule began, the indigenous Arab population became first extremely restive, then aggressive in fighting against what they saw would be waves of Jewish immigration that would transform what they saw as their land. There was a series of riots that then burst forth into a rebellion, an outright rebellion against British rule in the 1930s, as, of course, larger numbers of Jewish immigrants came to Palestine as a result of the persecution in Germany and the rising anti-Semitism elsewhere in Europe. So you had a period, I would argue, for the first 20 years that was dominated by negotiations, of course, from the Arab side, but also Arab violence in response to the Jewish immigration. You saw the emergence initially of Jewish self-defense groups or Jewish militias that, in their frustration that the British weren't doing enough to protect the Jewish community in Palestine, evolved into more militant and more aggressive forces that eventually became terrorist organizations. On neither side was there any kind of unity. There were a variety of different groups, many of whom used very different tactics, many of whom were far more brutal than the others. But I think what one sees over in essence, the 30-year period of British rule was the protracted use of violence by both sides in the firm conviction that this violence would affect, as I believe it ultimately did, British policy and British decision-making on the future of Palestine.
So eventually, cumulatively, it did make the difference?
Certainly it did. I don't think there's much disagreement amongst historians and others that in the 1920s and 1930s that Arab violence and Arab terrorism did not have a singularly important effect on British policy. By 1939, on the eve of World War II, Britain had fundamentally redefined its policy of Palestine, had clawed back its commitment to the Jewish national home because of Arab violence and terrorism. It becomes much more controversial in the 1940s when we see the Jewish variant, but I would argue that Jewish terrorism, the bombing of the King David Hotel, the attacks on British military and police targets, was a very important factor in the British decision to leave Palestine.
You mentioned the hotel bombing. Is there sort of the defining terrorist act of that period, that it was the one that everyone talks about?
It is. It's mostly misunderstood because, of course, it's portrayed very much in a contemporary context that this was a deliberate, willful attack against a hostelry filled with civilians. In point of fact, nothing could be further from the truth. The attack was not against the entire hotel, but rather against the southwestern wing, which housed the nerve center of British government in Palestine. It had the government secretariat offices, as well as the military command headquarters, as well as the intelligence headquarters. So that was the target. Unfortunately, I think the truism about war, that it's easy to start and difficult to control, also applies to terrorism. You can have a very selective, deliberate targeting, but often the results can be just as tragic for civilians inadvertently caught up in it. 91 persons perished in that bombing. In fact, until 1983, the King David Hotel bombing had that nefarious distinction of having been the most lethal terrorist operation in modern history.
Now, what you said earlier about the fact that there is no debate over whether this influenced policy, what does that say to nations or leaders who make pronouncements that you can't appease terrorists and that you can't give in to demands and that it doesn't work and that it's just futile violence against innocents? This seems to suggest something quite different, that it can be a force for political change.
That's exactly why I was drawn to the subject. That's the exact reason. The interesting thing is that there's not much debate during the Arab period. It's really in the Jewish period where there is, and you can see for obvious reasons, because if Jewish terrorism did have more of an effect on British decision-making than many people will grant it, well, obviously this is something that for the past 60 years has been pushed into the background because you don't want to encourage others then to use that same form of violence and to think that it can succeed against the state of Israel. But yes, I believe that certainly when you read accounts by Menachem Begin, who was the leader of the National Military Organization, as it called itself at the time, I mean, he doesn't call it terrorism, but certainly the strategy he talks about is one that we've seen.
What does he call it, by the way? How did he characterize it?
As you know, no terrorist in history has ever called himself a terrorist. It was a struggle of national liberation, much the same vernacular that's been used in recent decades. Very much so. But the point he makes is one that has resonated for decades afterwards, is that acts of carefully calibrated, daring and dramatic acts of violence can have a disproportionate impact on the decision-making and on the resolve of one's opponents, provided that they receive the requisite amounts of attention and publicity.
Now, I certainly understand this is a work in progress. You're not at the finish line yet, but your research so far, have you uncovered anything that has shifted the paradigm for you, changed your impression or your opinion of a historical period or an historical event? Anything new come up that has surprised you, essentially, is what I'm asking.
I think what has surprised me more than I would have imagined is that, you know, the past is indeed prologue in the sense that everything we see today in the conflict between the Palestinians and Israelis all happened before. I'll give you two examples. In the 1930s, while the entire globe was mired in the worst financial depression, at least in modern times, Palestine's economy was going great guns. There was tremendous investment by the British government in building many of the iconic landmarks in Jerusalem today. The YMCA building, the King David Hotel were all built during this period. There was lots of capital being transferred from Europe with Jewish immigrants coming. There was widespread employment. There was even immigration by people from surrounding areas for work. But nonetheless, nationalism and the political dimensions of the struggle still trumped or couldn't compensate for the economic advance. And Palestine in 1936 was plunged into a rebellion that essentially wrecked the country. Similarly, around this period, there was a bin Laden before there was even bin Laden. There was a Palestinian revolutionary named Ezel Al-Qassam, who was a religious figure in Haifa, who was in his late 50s, who forsook a relatively comfortable life, went to live in caves in the mountains of Galilee to wage war against the Jews and the British, embraced a very austere interpretation of Islam, Salafism, grew his beard long, wore very traditional clothing, spent as much time in religious study as in preparing for battle, and like bin Laden, fought from caves. I mean, he was far less successful.
Amazingly familiar story you're
It's
telling.
very familiar, yeah.
Well, with that in mind, we always lament that we don't learn the lessons of history. If there is a functional or practical or actionable item that you learn from this story that can be applied today, what is it?
There's no military solution to political problems or to terrorism, the cause of terrorism. That you certainly have to use force and potentially even involve the military, but to weaken the radicals, to deprive them of at least their faith in the efficacy of violence. But at the same time, it has to be accompanied by fundamental political reforms.
So why, like moths to the flame, do we continue to gravitate to military options?
I think because we fall into the trap that terrorists set for us. I mean, they're attempting to elicit a very emotional, what they hope will be an irrational and in turn a counterproductive response. They're hoping to force us to use violence because then they can portray themselves not as the aggressors but as the victims, or not as those who are responsible for the death and bloodshed caused to civilians and combatants alike, but rather the defenders of the populace. So we always fall into that trap and play into the sort of propaganda game that the terrorists hope to enmesh us in, and that in their hubris they believe they can win.
And the final question, I almost apologize for asking because most authors who are working on a book hate it, but when will we see the book?
Well, I hope the book will be finished by the end of this year, and that it'll be published in the end of 2013.
Great. Well, Bruce, thanks for the preview. We look forward to the book as well. Thanks for
My
joining
pleasure.
us today.
Thank you.
Thanks to all of you for joining us for this edition of Dialogue. We'll return next week with another edition. Until then, for all of us at the Wilson Center, I'm John Molesky. Thanks for joining us.
We'd like to hear from you. Please send your questions or comments to dialogue@wilsoncenter.org. You can also follow us on Facebook. Search Dialogue Radio and Television. Our host Twitter feed is twitter.com/John Milewski. Dialogue is a co-production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars and MHZ Networks. Dialogue is available via broadcast, cable, satellite, and telco on MHZ Worldview throughout the United States. To see how to watch where you live, visit www.mhznetworks.org.